because I myself have, on occasion, the opportunity to fly. So it's a little bit of self-interest in this for me. The safest mode and most efficient method of transportation is considered to be flying. We've all heard the statements and statistics continuously. The research of Harvard University itself is quoted as saying that flying in the US, Europe, and Australia is actually significantly safer than driving a car. Odds such as 1 in 1.2 million of an accident in flight, and 1 in 11 million of that accident being fatal. And it sounds great, but the statistics do not tell the whole story for me, because it doesn't speak to the variety of people and institutions who work behind the scenes to ensure that safety. People may not understand it, but civil aviation has been subjected to more international legislation and agreements than most other professions. Whether you're talking about the Chicago Convention of 1944, or we're talking about the Caribbean Aviation Safety and Security Oversight System Agreement, there are many and various agreements focused on achieving uniformity of standards, regulations, procedures, and practices. Now that's the point where I want to stay, on uniformity of regulations, standards, and procedures. When we pay for a ticket, line up very orderly, take our assigned seat, and buckle into a flight, we do so with an enormous amount of trust. You trust that the pilot has the necessary knowledge to fly this tin can with wings. You trust that the airline, before they hired him, verified that experience and knowledge. You trust that someone then double-checked behind them to make sure that all is well. Trust. 5th of May, 1972, Altia Flight 112 crashed into Mount Lunga after the flight crew did not adhere to the approach procedures established by the ATC. All 115 occupants perished. We trust that a plane meets all the standards and guidelines that the ground crew is responsible for. We trust that all the valves and seals have been checked and everything is functioning. We trust that local inspectors would have always double-checked behind them. We trust. 11th of May, 1996, ValueJet DC, 6 minutes after takeoff, a fire broke out in the cargo hold. That fire was because they were transporting some oxygen equipment and it wasn't stored properly. So pure oxygen leaked out into the cabin. This triggered a fire and a fiery crash. 110 souls lost. Because we trust. Have you ever been to the airport? One of my favorite activities sometimes when you're feeling the need to zen out is to watch the airplanes on the runway. You stay on the other end by the fence and you have a good look at them. And it looks like a dance sometimes, the way they go left and this person goes right. And, it's a beautiful thing. And while that is happening, the person who's sitting down on every one of those planes is trusting that someone is watching and coordinating the dance. That the pilot is listening to air traffic control, that air traffic control knows everyone that is on the runway, and that everyone is listening and communicating, because that's important. November 18th, 2022, LATAM Airlines jet collided with a fire truck, which was moving across the runway as the jet was about to make its takeoff. 2 firemen dead, 20 passengers injured, and a lot of questions based on trust. Sir, I personally believe in trust, but verified. You see, as safe as flying is, safety is based on adherence to policies. They're based on each country adhering to an agreed upon regulatory infrastructure. And the ICAO is responsible for this agreement about how we're going to proceed, where we're going to proceed, how we're going to test, and the necessary need for constant vigilance by each individual country. And because I know there will be those who look at this bill and call it a waste, there will be those that say that if every country follows the same rules already, then there's not a need to be as vigilant, to be as careful. We don't need to spend the funds on the Civil Aviation Authority. That's a waste. We have a Civil Aviation Department, after all. And we do have a department. No one is saying no. And that department does its very best with the legislation that it has in place and all the subsequent amendments. But to meet the needs for safety, not just for passengers and crew, but for everyone above and below that skyline. That department itself, through its Director of Civil Aviation in 2009, made a very clear point that it was necessary for an authority. He pointed out that civil aviation was somewhere it needs to be quick, instantaneous. You needed to make decisions on the fly. And the very nature of the civil service is not suited to what is necessary for a proper civil aviation dynamic. Aviation is changing. It changes quite quickly. The Deputy President pointed out that there are various issues involved, including that of climate change. And so, when the leader of Senate speaks towards capacity restrictions, resource deficiencies, she isn't speaking in absentia. She is speaking about the fact that for a great number of years, we have had a civil aviation department that has done its best with what it has. But it just cannot continue. It cannot continue if we want to do better. There needs greater autonomy for us to properly conduct civil aviation needs. And I'm happy that we as a government are moving towards this particular point. And for those who are still skeptical, I want to say thank you for the Auntie Olga-sized level of trust that you have. But are you willing to place your life on that trust? Are you willing to bet that Betty Sue at O'Hara Airport has completed all her checks correctly? Are you willing to bet that Abdul in Calcutta or Benin in Nigeria has gone through every single thing he was supposed to do, and then his supervisor and his supervisor have all checked? Are we willing to say that we are going to abdicate what is our responsibility in favor of someone else having done it for us? We love our partners. We love all of those who hopefully will be bringing their planes and plane loads of exciting and happy tourists to our shores. But we cannot give over our sovereign rights and responsibility for the safety of all. So as we take our place in the world, as we open new corridors of trade and investment and the inevitable travel of people, goods, and services, we cannot rest on the idea that we punch above our weight. Not when our national behavior is as though we are scared to throw a punch. When some of us behave as though we have to rest on our laurels. We've been operating from a level of comfortability in some areas as the world moves on. As this region, who we've led for quite a while, catches up and in some cases surpasses us. I am unwilling to be left behind, sir. Not when I know that in the souls of the citizens of this country, there are still leaders. There are still people who believe that Barbados has the right and the responsibility to push to be better, and to do better. I would argue it has become a problem. We have become comfortable with our reputation. But we must regain the hunger to do better, sir. And this government has continued to show the way. Our Prime Minister and those under her continue to push for more, for better, for us to lead, for us to define the narrative rather than follow it. Because we cannot be a country that just settles in atrophy, sir. There will be successes, I know, and there will be failures. But we cannot rest in stagnation with this idea that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We tell ourselves that often, rather than moving with progress over perfection. There are too many people who will look at situations and say, it's not perfect, so go nowhere. It's not perfect yet, so just leave it there until it gets to perfection. Perfection is a fantasy, sir. The reality is progress is what we are here to do. As best as we can, however we can, but it must be progress. So as we continue to move on cutting edge sphere, to be right there in this cut and thrust of international and local, regional needs, let us not rest on the laurels of past triumph and tribute. Let us continue what was a very clear habit of Barbadians past, to push for better and to go for gold. And so I support this legislation with my very, very quick contribution and the underpinning ideals. And I look forward to passing our next IQ audit and raising our status to category 1, where we should be and where we must be. With that, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Roberts-Olu. Senator Mr. Millard.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I've become accustomed to reading large documents, but this one is incredibly complicated and complex. And I suspect, like most people in here, I have not digested it at all. I too broadly support this bill, Mr. President. But, Mr. President, there are areas in this bill that I feel concerned about. And the concern, Mr. President, goes back to something I mentioned, I think it was in my last contribution last week. And it relates to regulations, but I'll speak to that at the end. Among the definitions in this bill, Mr. President, there's a definition for an unmanned aircraft. And we speak about civil aviation. Most people think of commercial aircraft, which carries people and commercial property and animals and stuff. But we've not spent any time talking about unmanned aircraft. And I'm not speaking about the military types. That's a matter for a different agency. Mr. President, the world has changed a lot. And how we viewed unmanned aircraft 10 years ago is entirely different from how we see it today. And I don't know if in this legislation there's enough attention paid to unmanned aircraft. Now, in this country, it is pretty restrictive to fly unmanned aircraft. You cannot, in fact, as far as I recall, and Senator Cummins can correct me if I'm wrong, you can't fly a drone, and I'll call them drones, for taking photographs. If you have a drone and you want to use it, even the ones that have a 50-foot radius, and you want to use it outside of your house, you have to have permission to fly it. But that is an antiquated position, Mr. President, because the world has changed. Now, drones have many, many commercial applications, from agriculture, Mr. President, to security. And we had a massive ashfall some time ago, and in some places, men would not have been put on top of roofs to clean those panels. You'd be able to fly a drone to clean them. And with large commercial photovoltaic systems, drones are used to map problems, and they're used to clean the panels. Mr. President, I don't think that we can continue to put in a line item for unmanned aircraft. Unmanned aircraft are not just 250 gram little devices. They are large aircraft that serve many, many functions. Now, excuse me, well, I accept that the military drones, the defined legal military drones, will have regulations that are covered under the Ministry of Defense and Security. There are uses of drones that have happened in the last 10 months, Mr. President, where there's been adaptation of drones for lots of purposes that have turned out might not be within the law in this country. And therefore, it's an area that needs to be seriously looked at and discussed. And I don't think that what's happening in this legislation, that really we've not had enough time to truly flesh out, it has been given enough attention. Now, Mr. President, there's a section in this legislation that deals, I think it's under the schedule, where it states that the minister shall make regulations. And the areas, 25, and the areas are so extensive that it starts at letter A, and then it starts at double A. Now, it tells us, therefore, that the regulations for this bill, this act when it's passed, are so extensive that it will form a document far bigger than what we have here. But we, once again, will not see it. We are seeing the skeleton, Mr. President. Now, Mr. President, I have a real concern about regulations. And I think I mentioned it when I spoke on the last occasion in this chamber. And I just whispered to the Deputy President, Mr. President, about, because I can see, Mr. President, that the Deputy President, and I know, understands this document inside out, the standing orders. And there's a committee, Mr. President, called the Regulations Committee. And I believe, Mr. President, you head that committee. And within the standing orders, it lays out what the Regulations Committee is supposed to do. And there are several honourable members of this chamber who are on that committee. I believe the leader of government business is also on the committee. But it doesn't function. And nowhere can I find anything in this parliament, this records, that shows me that it has functioned. So I want to apologize for misleading the Senate the last time I stood, Mr. President, because I said that we don't have a chance to see the regulations in that form. And I was wrong. So I apologize to the chamber, Mr. President. The Senate, according to these regulations, is authorized to see the regulations. It's here, Mr. President, on page 43, under the Regulations Committee, in the 2003 amended version of the standing orders. It says, under the Regulations Committee, there shall be a regulations committee which shall consist, not mayor, which shall consist of the president as chairman and 4 senators to be nominated by the committee of selection, which shall have the duty of considering all such regulations as defined by the Interpretation Act for the time being in force, as under the authority of any law, are to be laid before the Senate and to bring to the attention of the Senate any regulation. And then it goes from A to F. And it concludes, but the Regulations Committee shall not consider or report on the merits or policy of any regulations. So there is a committee established in these standing orders that deals with regulations, Mr. President, the ones that we complain that we don't get to see. And I guess all of us have copies of the standing orders. Pardon? On the Regulations Committee, that is select committees, 60. Number 5. Mr. President, if we, I do not know a lot about parliamentary procedure. So I suppose there'll be some document or book that will guide us on parliamentary practice. But my simple interpretation of this, if we select a committee that, and it has a function, and such an important function, then it should function. So I would like, Mr. President, if what I'm saying is true, that the committee should function so that the Senate, sir, can be appraised of the regulations to all these bills that we pass in this Parliament, and you'll be aware of them, Mr. President. I thank you.
Thank you, Senator Maynard. Any other speakers? Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I want to express my appreciation for all of the contributions on this bill. I accept that it is a complex bill, and certainly when I first started to get immersed in the process, this took hours upon hours upon hours, and like I did say, we did have to get technical experts to come into Barbados for the purpose of guiding us through all of this, and I outlined our technical assistance approach as a consequence of this. And so it is on that basis that I myself then became fully immersed and comfortable in the content. And so I have no difficulty readily appreciating that such a large bill with such complex matters that are obviously not things that we do on a day-to-day basis would be cumbersome in some instances and would require further explanation. And so I have no difficulty with the recommendation at all in principle for explanatory notes to be outlined. But I think that, even if we were to provide explanatory notes, perhaps there would still be some difficulty with understanding that which is contained within the explanatory notes, because then we would have to go the next step, which is to have technical officials and civil servants and the public officials there to help explain that which is contained. So I accept that it is very much an extensive process. But let me start, first of all, with, having said that, let me go back to Senator Brathwaite's contribution. So Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite made the important point about costs, which was echoed by the Deputy President of the Chamber, Senator Thompson. And it is a fair point to make, but what I'll say to you here, Mr. President, and it's an interesting and perhaps a complicated way of responding, which is to say this: I never knew the complexities of what it was to govern and to navigate the things that have to be done while navigating public sentiment, stakeholder sentiment all at once until I was actually in government. There's a certain luxury that comes sometimes from being on the outside of government and only seeing one side of it. And therefore thinking that you have to be able to do A or B readily because the only thing to consider is A or B, when in actual fact, it may go all the way down to double A, as was just said by Senator Maynard. Now, Mr. President, in May of this year, a paper came before me, and I want to be as open as I can here, as I always am. In May of this year, a paper came before me on the question that you have just asked, Senator Brathwaite, on the question of costs. How we would rationalize the treatment of costs for the Civil Aviation Authority. Now, in May of this year, in June, in July, August, September, and every month of the year, there is an extensive conversation about how expensive airline tickets are in this country. In this very chamber, we have had this conversation already. The government should remove all of the taxes. The government should reduce the cost of airline travel. We shouldn't have this and we shouldn't have that. Mr. President, we looked at the various things that constitute the cost of taxation on airline tickets. And I want to take a moment to break it down in the context of this debate in order to give the answer to that question. Mr. President, there is a security fee that covers the cost of all of the security apparatus to meet the requirements of aviation security, on the one hand. So every scanner, every X-ray machine, every explosive tracing device, all of those things is covered by every passenger who passes through the airport paying an $8 security fee. Mr. President, there are landing fees which accrue to the Grant Adams International Airport. Those things go to service things like the repavement of the runway, the maintenance of the aerodrome, things like all of the support services provided, including to the air traffic control tower. Those fees levied to the GAIA go to service those needs. And then, Mr. President, there is the value-added tax, which is a standard consumption fee. And then there is the airport service charge, which goes to capitalize the Barbados Tourism Marketing, Inc., not taxpayers' money, as sometimes you hear people who are supposedly shadow ministers for tourism talking about, but don't even understand how tourism is capitalized through the BTMI, through the airport service charge, and not Barbados taxpayer dollars. Every departing passenger from the country pays an airport service charge. If they are a Caribbean traveler, they pay $70 USD. But if they are an international traveler, they pay $70 USD. If they are a Caribbean traveler, they pay 50% of that. And that capitalizes the Barbados Tourism Marketing, Inc. The proposal that came to me, Mr. President, came in the midst of a national discussion on how expensive airline tickets were as a result of additional charges levied by taxation by the government of Barbados. And the proposal, therefore, Mr. President, to capitalize the Civil Aviation Authority and its creation by levying a fee or by pulling from the fees and charges applied at the Grant Adams International Airport by travelers was something at the time that we had to pause on, Mr. President, because the need to establish a Civil Aviation Authority had to be offset against the fact that international travel was in free fall. The cost of international travel was already a concern, and we had to be able to navigate all of those different balancing acts, Mr. President, in order to do the things that needed to be done while still managing the things that we all wanted to be able to see done. And so there is enshrined in this legislation at I believe it is Article 25.1, the establishment of a civil aviation fund. And that fund is meant to be able to rationalize how we will reposition many of the fees and charges that are already applied at the border to help to capitalize the Civil Aviation Authority. And secondly, once that decision at a policy level has been made, the provision is allowed in general regulations in Article 139(1)(e) to have the minister, in collaboration with the various agencies, make the decision under the regulations as to fees and other charges in order to capitalize the Civil Aviation Authority. There was a paper that was prepared by the consultants, which looked at models around the world, including South Africa, that looked at recommendations on how civil aviation authorities globally were capitalized and how we were able to establish them. In this instance, it would be a regulatory entity and not necessarily a state-owned enterprise in a way in which you would have other agencies, but it is earmarked for capitalization by direct user fees in the main and in part by way of a direct grant or subvention from central government and the consolidated fund. But it is not meant to be a draw on central government. It is meant to be funding itself, including, Mr. President, user fees. So, for example, we had an extensive discussion around the certification of certain types of aircraft where we do not have the types of skills available. So we may have officers certified on certain types of aircraft, but not on other types of aircraft that want to operate in and out of Barbados. And the mechanism that we put in place for us to be able to do that, Mr. President, was that the user, in this instance, the client, the customer in this instance, would have to pay the associated costs with acquiring the skills required for the certification of what we call the air operator certificate for a particular aircraft. And those are some of the mechanisms that will come to capitalize the Civil Aviation Authority through user fees, through passenger charges, and through potential passenger charges without pushing the cost of airline travel up, because I simply could not have agreed to a further levy on airline tickets when we were already having these kinds of discussions. But at the same time, the Civil Aviation Authority has to be navigated. The Grand Islands Airport has to be capitalized, security fees have to be capitalized, and those are the things that constitute the difficult decisions of governance, Mr. President. It looks easy from on the outside when we can just say, you shouldn't do that, or we should do this, or you need this, and you need that. And I hear those conversations sometimes, but sometimes, I promise you, there's so much more in that mortar than in the pestle. But I give the commitment that this is something that has received extensive attention. Papers have been written by our experts and our consultants, and it will be given the due consideration of the government to ensure that we keep the public purse secure. Now, Senator Malalou made important points about the financial statements, and there is a provision in the Public Finance Management Act that allows for reporting by central government, by state-owned enterprises, and by commercial state-owned enterprises on an annual basis and on a half-yearly basis. And it also allows for surcharges to be levied by the person who we know as the Director of Finance and Economic Affairs if the information is not submitted in a timely manner or if the information is incorrect. So there are mechanisms, and that legislation was passed through this chamber in 2019, and so we have the mechanisms there. Now, let me pause for a moment and come back to Senator Malalou's second part of his question to say something that I forgot to say earlier in terms of transparency and accountability. Mr. President, transparency and accountability is important, yes, and stakeholder buy-in is important, yes. It is for that reason, Mr. President, that I took a paper to Cabinet in 2021 proposing the establishment of a Civil Aviation Authorities Transition Committee. It includes all of the stakeholders that are technically a part of the process, all of the agencies that are involved in the process, and it also includes the labor union that represents the workers that work in the sector. There was and there is continuously, we mustn't throw these terms about transparency and accountability just because we may not know, when in actual fact the structures are very much in place for all of the stakeholders and have been established by government, by the cabinet, approved by the government, and it is chaired not even by me, it is chaired by the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Tourism and International Transport, who convenes those meetings with all of the stakeholders to ensure that there is transparency and accountability and that everybody on this transition committee is able to see all of the specifics of the legislation. There will then be the part of the committee will have the relationship, has had the relationship, I should say, with our various consultants who are here, and then they will usher us through the process of transitioning with everybody on board. I have even had instances, Mr. President, where over the course of time, we had the air traffic controllers who I met with one morning at 7:30 for the purpose of bringing them up to speed on where we were, what we were doing. So the fact that I may not know doesn't mean that all the stakeholders in the sector do not know, and that therefore there's no transparency or accountability. And we must be careful about saying things like that. Now, I want also, Mr. President, to then go back to, and I will come to the points raised by Senator Maynard as well, but I want to go back to Senator Malalou's second point. And he spoke about facilitation and poor health and those kinds of things. And it's a fair point. We have all been on an aircraft, sitting, waiting for the stairs to come to the aircraft, and then for those persons to hustle and go back down the stairs. And we understand that this sometimes can be something that we don't understand. But you know what, Mr. President, we in Port Health, they hand over the information to Port Health in person, yes. They do so in other international airports as well. We just don't see them when they come to the air bridge. Very much there. We also, Mr. President, receive that information electronically by way of advanced passenger information, and that is submitted to the agencies. There is also an agency that deals with advanced customs information and advanced passenger information called the JRCC. And all of the information, whether agriculture, health, immigration, or customs, is submitted in advance, and it is the reason why the actual documentation which was submitted electronically. How many times, Mr. President, have we been on board a plane and we hear, or in an airport, we hear that they're paging passengers so and so and so and so on a given flight heading to, and if you don't come, your bags are going to be taken off of the aircraft. Because, Mr. President, the advanced passenger information system will submit the persons who are booked to travel on that plane and who have been submitted to go before. But if a passenger is taken off, Mr. President, then that advanced passenger information has to be updated by that which is submitted when that person lands, when that plane actually lands. So there's always a reconciliation of that which comes in advance and that what happens when the plane actually lands. But I want to say, though, that I take the point about the need for us to depend far more heavily on technology, and I support that fully. Now, Senator Maynard spoke about the unmanned civil aviation issues. Well, specifically, we call them drones. Those are not captured in this legislation, except insofar as they do make some reference to it. We even had, I believe, one of the last changes we had a meeting with the full team and the Attorney General, and the Attorney General was, one of the changes we agreed in that discussion was on the definition of pilots. And that was meant to include pilots not only of aircraft as we are traveling on them, but unmanned aerial aircraft. The Civil Aviation Department, and I want to, in a sidebar conversation with Senator Maynard, I misspoke. The Barbados Civil Aviation Department regulates only recreational use of drones, recreational and not commercial. Military use falls under the National Security Council, so it would not fall underneath there, and that's the reason why the legislation actually speaks expressly to exemptions for that purpose. It is not governed under this legislation. But there's a broader issue, Mr. President, around legislation that comes to this chamber and to the other place, but that is being dealt with by the Law Reform Commission. Mr. President, this legislation, Order Number 2, and the 2 subsidiary pieces of legislation under Order Number 3 correspond to a number of other pieces of legislation, and there are consequential amendments that are listed in here, including but not limited to the Airports Act, because we have to speak to that and there has to be some changes in the definition. But there will also be at least 2 additional pieces of subsidiary legislation, one relating to civil aviation unmanned aircraft systems. There's a draft Civil Aviation Unmanned Aircraft Systems Bill, and then a second piece of legislation which speaks, and this is recreational, and a second piece of legislation which speaks to the commercial management of unmanned aircraft systems. Now, on the basis of the current regime, the Civil Aviation Department has approximately 5 main areas for drone activity. The last changes which were made were for recreational purposes, were made in 2020. And so we have Sterling Lynch's in St. Philip, Dash Valley in St. George, College Savannah, St. John, and then the last one which was added was in Vaucluse. And so there is separate legislation outside of this which will come alongside or will be passed alongside of this particular piece of legislation specifically to deal with unmanned aviation aircraft systems. And so we will have an opportunity to be able to go through what that looks like and how it is applied and what the specifics are, because Senator Maynard is absolutely right. There has been so much that has happened in technology over the last several years, and the ability to be able to treat to these things both positively and in some way, some instances, defensively, it is going to be critical. But you won't see everything sometimes in a single piece of legislation. Now, finally, the point of regulations. You're right. There are going to be substantial regulations that go along with this legislation. And they will very much speak to the issues that you have raised about transparency and predictability as well. I have had partners come to me on more than one occasion to say, what is the objective process, not the subjective process, by which an aircraft operations, an AOC certificate is given? On what basis are we certifying pilots? What are the objective mechanisms that are being used? And those things are worked out in regulations. Again, those are things that are worked out in regulations on the basis of ICAO, not on the basis of Barbados, not on the basis of my say-so alone, but on the basis of ICAO and the technical expertise that they have provided to Barbados to ensure that we are there. Now, what we have done, and one of the last things that I would have done before I left that ministry and transitioned out, was to speak to the establishment of what we call a regulatory sandbox. And Mr. President, you would know this from a different area of activity, which I am also now navigating, which is on international business, and ensuring that we are able to keep pace with evolving regulations and to have model drafts and model text always readily available, so we're never in a position where we fall behind the curve in the way that we were not necessarily keeping pace with the curve. And so we now are looking to make sure that as we can see down the pipeline, we know that there are regulations coming in a number of areas. We are working to ensure that we have those coming into Barbados and keeping pace and keeping ahead of the curve. Because there are countries, Mr. President, that were Category 1 and were downgraded to Category 2. There were civil aviation authorities that attained the highest standard and then dropped back down. And so we have to make sure that not only do we reach the standard, that we maintain the standard and then begin to exceed it. And so these are some of the key things, Mr. President, that I wanted to be able to respond to and to share with the colleagues. I want to also give Senator Maynard the assurance that when we were developing the draft bill on drones for recreational purposes, that in 2021, I did lead a virtual, at the time we were in the midst of COVID, but even with COVID, I did have a full virtual consultation with the entire community, including the association representing unmanned aviation systems, some of the enthusiasts who follow drones, and all of them who were invited that came. There were many who were not able to come. There were even some people who live abroad and who shared their inputs. And the bill was drafted with a view to ensuring that all of the stakeholders can have an opportunity to feed in and to benefit from newly established legislation and in due course as well, newly established regulations. So, Mr. President, I want to thank you all again for your input into the draft into the discussion today, the debate on this piece of legislation, and I beg to move on that basis that this bill now be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Comments?
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honour do not leave the chair and the Senate dissolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honourable the Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Madam Chair, as indicated by an earlier senator, this is a very long bill. And if we had to call by clauses, we'd probably be here till 6 o'clock. So I'm seeking the Senate's permission to call in parts.
Permission granted.
Thank you. Clause 1. Clause 1 to start with.
The chair recognizes Senator Dr. Brathwaite.
Thank you kindly, Deputy President of the Senate. Before we consider all the clauses, I just wanted to make a small statement which responds to Senator Cummins' explanation with respect to costs.
No, Senator,
Can you hear
I'm
me?
sure that your statement has much food for thought contained. Unfortunately, I'm not clear what you're raising on it. I don't think that this is the time for you to raise. So if you're going to respond to the senator, you will perhaps have to do it appropriately under one of the clauses or on some under one of the clauses when they're raised.
It's just an extension, Vice President, of what I said earlier.
I'm going to
It
let.
has to do with the administrative.
No, we are now in committee, and therefore any statement made by the honourable senator has to be made in the context of the section which is before the chamber. Having made your substantive speech on matters relating to the general legislation, you cannot now intervene. I'm suggesting to the senator that I do want to hear you because I know that your contributions normally have great substance, but I have to bring you within the umbrella of the rules, and I'm attempting to do that by suggesting to you that if you look at a section which will come up in committee under which your comments will naturally fall, you can then raise them at that time.
Thank you, Vice President. I'll be guided accordingly. Thank you.
I'm so glad that you did not resist me. Honourable Leader of the House.
So it's clause 1. Clause 1.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that clause 1 stand part.
The question is that clause 1 stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 1, clauses 2 and 3.
The question is that part 1,
No, not yet. Not yet. You just recognizing me.
the honourable Leader of the House, of the Senate.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that part 1 stand part.
The question is that part 1 stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. And those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 2, clauses 4 through 7.
We recognise Senator Cummings.
Part 2, clauses 4, Madam Chairman, I beg to move that part 2, clauses 4 through 7 stand part.
The question is that part 2, clauses 4 through 7 do now stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. And those against, please say nay. The ayes have it.
Part 3, clauses 8 through 13.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Part 3, clauses 8 through 13 stand part.
The question is that Part 3, clauses 8 through 13 stand part. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. And those against, please say nay. The ayes have it.
Part 4, clauses 14 through 17.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Part 4, clauses 14 through 17 stand part.
The question is that Part 4, clauses 14 through 17 stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
And those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 5, clauses 18 through 24.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Part 5, clauses 18 through 24 stand part.
The question is that Part 5, clauses 18 through 24 do now stand part. All those senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 6, clauses 25 to 33.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Part 6, clauses 25 to 33 stand part.
The chair recognizes Senator Dr. Brathwaite.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. I just had a small comment which related to the response given by the distinguished leader of government business in the Senate, Senator Cummings. And to say that the question that I raised this morning with respect to costs has nothing to do with belittling in any way the importance of this work and its importance for the future development of civil aviation in Barbados. It is in fact an important advance in our development. And I said this morning, I congratulate the government for the actions that have been taken. But I wanted to make a simple point, which I think I need to reiterate, with respect to financial viability of initiatives that would be approved in this honorable chamber. And I say this in the context of the fact that I am aware that there have been initiatives that have had significant international financial support, that when that financial support is not available, the initiatives become not viable. And I think there's an important point to make with respect to how we approve things, because we wish to approve them with the understanding that they are viable, that they have long-term sustainability, that an initiative as important as this is critical for our country, and the long-term financial stability is assured. But I have lived through situations where initiatives have received substantial international financial support, and when that international financial support is no longer available, they become non-viable. So I just wanted to make that point as a point of reference which we should take into consideration when we consider initiatives as important as this one.
And I'm grateful for your intervention, Senator, but I am helping to bring you to conclusion of your very interesting point, but not properly captured under in the committee process as the standing orders require. I know that we're all still learning the process. This is a very new space still. But perhaps there might be some utility to having a general learning session, a conversation with the clerks to guide us as to process, because there is a process for when one is making a general speech. There is a process then where the leader of business, of government business, or any other speaker is speaking on the substance of an issue, and you can rise on a point of order or on several other points, and you can rise on a point of elucidation, and you can challenge them, you can elaborate on points that you made earlier which were being misrepresented perhaps, and that is the structure within which you can intervene. When we come into committee, it is a far more prescribed space and process where how you speak, what you speak to must relate directly to the particular clauses in a specific kind of way, and they do not allow latitude for general speeches. Now, out of an abundance of affection and latitude, I gave you the latitude on this occasion, but I am, you know how our parents would give you a backhand slap and then tell you, come and eat your food. That was their way of saying, well, I slap you to discipline you, but I still love you. So now I will, and that was by way of my extended explanation as to process, and my appeal then to the clerks to help us become more familiar, because I think that it will also build confidence and make for better debates if people have a clear understanding of the rules, how to interrupt, how to intervene, how to engage, how to contradict, how to cut down when necessary. But I want purely to give you, Honourable Senator, the most gentle guidance today.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, just to add, in relation to elucidation, you can only raise on that point if you're actually elucidating your own speech. Just as,
I thank the clerk for that very useful intervention, because the truth is that I've been around these parks for so long, I took it for granted that people knew that, but it was that really was very useful guidance, because I don't think that people necessarily understand that.
Madam President, if you may just
Is
permit.
the limit of my affection for all of you going to be tested now?
Madam President, I just wanted to raise on a point of order, because I understand the ruling that you've just made, but it comes against the backdrop of what I see creeping in a practice now where, when we get to committee, we are reverting to tactics that should be used in the second reading speeches. Last week, when we came into committee, an undertaking was given that we would check with the Parliamentary Reform Commissioner on the usage of a single word or the elimination of that word, and that assurance was not necessarily accepted, and it wasn't saying that the Honourable Senator who made the objection was begrudgingly doing so. But there is a process in committee, and we also had a situation where after the Senate voted on a bill, a senator rose to ask if we understood what we had voted on, and brought the proceedings to a halt, because we then had to stop to find out what was going on. I think these bad practices are happening because we are not necessarily all sure about the processes by which we pass these bills. So that what the Honourable Senator just gave was really a response to the Leader of Government Business in her concluding speech, which is not possible under our rules. So that we understand and accept the point that he's made, but the committee stage cannot now be used as a place to canvass responses to the rapid speech of the minister leading the debate. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Senator Nichols for his very useful intervention, but this is why I appealed earlier to the clerks. When we come into this space, we receive a copy of the standing orders. We read them, but without context. If you are not a member of this chamber and you are hearing debate, You listen to it from the perspective of a point, whether political sympathy or some point of social or economic interest or just to hear good debate. You are not listening with a view to what the rules require and whether or not the rules are being complied with. So that when we all came in, we got copies of the standing orders, but we didn't see them in a living context. We are reading words on a page. So this is why I'm saying now that we have gone through some weeks of activity, and some of us are newer in the space than others, it may perhaps be useful to have a working session that treats to the standing orders, how they're to be used, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. So, because I don't think that any senator, and I give all honourable senators the benefit of the doubt, I do not think that any honourable senator is deliberately misapplying, misusing, or attempting to corrupt the process of the rules and standing orders, so that we want to learn together, so that we can have an exceptionally well-functioning Senate. And I look forward to the cooperation of all members and to the clerks for responding to my request. And with all of that, I've forgotten where we are, so if somebody could remind me. We are at part 7 now?
No, part 7.
Part 5, and that was sections.
Part 6, not 5.
Well, the whole house is unclear.
No, under administrative and financial provisions.
Part 6.
Under which he wrote.
So,
25 to 33?
So-
It's part 6, 25
yes,
to
so
33.
part 6, clauses 25 to 33.
The question is, part 6, clauses 25 to 33 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 7, clauses 34 to 39.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that part 7, clauses 34 to 39 do now stand part.
Question is that part 7, clauses 34 to 39 do now stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 8, clauses 40 to 65.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that part 8, clauses 40 to 65 stand part.
The question is that part 8, clauses 40 to 65 do now stand part. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 9, clauses 66 to 71.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that part 9, clauses 66 through 71 stand part.
The question is that part 9, clauses 66 to 71 do now stand part. With those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 10, clauses 72 to 77.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that part 10, clauses 72 to 77 do now stand part.
The question is that part 10, clauses 72 to 77 do now stand part. All those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. And those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Part 11, clauses 78 to 86.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that part 11, clauses 78 through 86 do now stand part.
The question is that part 11, clauses 78 to 86 do now stand part. Will all those in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 12, clauses 87 to 100.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that part 12, clauses 87 through 100 stand part.
The question is that Part 12, clauses 87 through 100 do now stand part. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. And those against, kindly say no. The ayes have it.
Part 13, clauses 101 through 103.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Part 13, clauses 101 to 103 stand part.
Question is that Part 13, clauses 101 to 103 do now stand part. Will those in favor please say aye? Aye. Will those against please say no? The ayes have it.
Part 14, clauses 104 to 110.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Part 14, clauses 104 to 110 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 14, clauses 104 to 110 do now stand part. Will those in favor please say aye? Aye. Will those against please say no? The ayes have it.
Part 15, clauses 111 to 129.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Part 15, clauses 111 to 129 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 15, clauses 111 to 129 do now stand part. Please, those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it.
Part 16, clauses 130 to 153.
Madam Chairman, we're nearing the end. I beg to move that Part 15, clauses 130 through 153 do now stand. Through 16, clauses 130 through 153.
The question is, with Part 16, clauses 113 to 153 do now stand part. Will those in favor say aye, please? Aye. And will those against say no? The ayes have it.
First schedule.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that the first schedule be the schedule to the bill, be the first schedule to the bill.
The question is that the first schedule be the schedule to the bill. The first schedule be the first schedule to the bill. Will those in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The ayes have it.
Second schedule.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that the second schedule be the second schedule to the bill.
Question is that the second schedule be the second schedule to the bill. Those in favor please say aye. Aye. Those against please say no. The ayes have it.
Third schedule.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that the third schedule be the third schedule to the bill.
The question is that the third schedule be the third schedule to the bill. Will those in favor please say aye? Aye. And those against please say no. The ayes have it.
Fourth schedule.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that the fourth schedule be the fourth schedule to the bill.
The question is that the fourth schedule be the fourth schedule to the bill. Will those in favor please say aye? And those against please say no. The ayes have it.
The fifth schedule.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that the fifth schedule be the fifth schedule to the bill.
The question is that the fifth schedule be the fifth schedule to the bill. Those in favor please say aye. Aye. Those against please say no. The ayes have it.
The sixth schedule.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that the sixth schedule be the sixth schedule to the bill.
The question is that the sixth schedule be the sixth schedule to the bill. Those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Report.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honor the President of the Senate the passing of one bill in committee.
The Question is that we now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The President has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Oh, the chairman, Madam, has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the reading of this bill a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, it is my pleasure to beg to move that this bill now do pass and be cited as the Civil Aviation Act 2022.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Civil Aviation Act 2022. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited.
Order number 3, sir. In the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Civil Aviation, Air Navigation Services and Investigation of Accidents Bill 2022.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the Senate do now dissolve itself into committee for further.
Second time.
This bill be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the Senate do now dissolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that they do not leave the chair and the Honourable Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Madam Chairman, as with the previous bill, seek your permission to call this one in parts as well.
Permission granted.
Clause 1.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 1 stand part.
The question is that Clause 1 do now stand part. Those in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 1, Clause 2.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Part 1, Clause 2 stand part.
Question is that Part 1, Clause 2 stand part. Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 2, Clauses 3 through 8.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Part 2, Clauses 3 through 8 stand part.
The question is that Part 2, Clauses 3 through 8 stand part. Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 3, Clauses 9 through 13.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Part 3, Clauses 9 through 13 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 3, Clauses 9 through 13 do now stand part. Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 4, Clauses 14 through 46.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Part 4, Clauses 14 through 46 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 4, Clauses 14 through 46 do now stand part. Those in favor, please say aye. Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 5, clauses 47 through 57.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Part 5, clauses 47 through 57 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 5, clauses 47 through 57 do now stand part. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Report.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee. Those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as a Civil Aviation Air Navigation Services and Investigation of Accidents Act 2022.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Civil Aviation Air Navigation Services and Investigation of Accidents Act 2022. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited.
Order number 4, sir. In the name of the Honourable Minister of State in the Prime Minister's office, to move the passing of a resolution to approve in accordance with Section 5 of the Land Acquisition Act, Chapter 228, the compulsory acquisition by the state of parcels of land situate at Kensington New Road and at Beckles Land, New Orleans, in the parish of St. Michael in this island, for the public purpose of housing development.
Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President. As I rise to speak to the resolution before us, I hope you don't mind, Mr. President, if I do take this time to welcome back Madam Deputy President. It's always good to hear your voice. I don't know that there are persons who are perhaps younger than yourselves, or let me say of a lesser age, that would have been able to work as hard as you did in Egypt during COP27, and then immediately come back home to this honourable chamber and stand on their feet and deliver as you did, Madam Deputy President. So kudos to you. Mr. President, as I speak to this resolution, I do also want to note that certainly the work that Madam Deputy President was doing as she laboured along with the senior public officers who were with her at COP27 is not divorced from this topic. This resolution to move residents from an area that is flood prone in the area of Murphy's Land speaks to the heart of the issues about how, as a country, we are going to also be able to adapt to the ongoing climate issues that will impact us. During COP27, the ambassador in her role then as head of the delegation, would have been speaking to issues of mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the issues of adaptation, how will we adapt to these climate events, and also the issues of loss and damage as well. So that in the context of an adverse event, what happens after? How do we address those losses? We have come to accept, certainly, Mr. President, living in Barbados, living in the Caribbean, living in a small island developing states, that we will have hurricanes, that we will have flooding, that we will have natural disasters. We think of it as a way of life, Mr. President. But what climate change is doing is actually exacerbating those conditions that we have said to ourselves that we need to be able to live with, such that they are imperiling our very way of life. I don't know, Mr. President, if this Honourable Chamber will remember that just a couple of months ago, we had a report of flooding in Pakistan. And well, as we would all appreciate, Pakistan is used to flooding in the context of its monsoon season. What happened was that flooding was 3 times above the 30-year average of floods in Pakistan. It killed 1,500 persons and displaced 30 million. It displaced 30 million. We have reports that sea level rise, for instance, in the UK, will displace another 200,000 persons, Mr. President. And very often, we see and we hear these issues and we don't necessarily relate them to our very everyday lives. So that the work that Madam Deputy President was doing in the context of COP27, the work that our Prime Minister has been advocating about, is very much about our everyday and present reality. As I said before, Mr. President, those things that we have said to ourselves that we accept in this context will make our lives unlivable. The relocation of those 7 households, and I emphasize that 7 households because unfortunately, there are those who hear what they want to hear and report what they want to report as opposed to reporting the facts. And as in the other place, as it was emphasized that there were 7 households and not the entirety of all of the households in the area. We are relocating those 7 households, again, because they are in the direct vicinity of flooding that impacts how they live, impacts their well-being, Mr. President. And the fact is that if the government does not step in and address it, that in the context that I've been describing of climate change, we will even see further adverse impacts for those residents. Mr. President, I want to also note as well that this resolution, and we've had several resolutions such as these are intended to allow for the government to compulsory acquire land for housing purposes. And this falls very much within the ambit of the government's silent revolutions, as indicated in the budget, because it is extremely critical for us to be able to address the socio-economic conditions of people in a holistic and comprehensive way. The silent revolution on housing, yes, it is about providing affordable housing for Barbadians, but it goes further. It is not just about the nature of the housing, it's not just about the shelter, but it is about the type of shelter, it's about the quality of shelter that is provided. It's about the extent to which when Barbadians and families can walk into their houses and feel a sense of pride It is when they can look within, around their environs and feel a certain sense of safety, a certain sense of comfort, Mr. President. This is something that we all want, you and I. And so that in the context of having residents who are in direct areas of ongoing flooding that they have been living with for some time, and Mr. President, I want to admit and indicate that the government has tried to provide some alleviation. There was an attempt to have a water catchment facility built, but we recognize that that was not sufficient in order to be able to alleviate the situation, and more so in the context of the development of that canal, you then had residents who were then became situated right next to the canal. So you had a compounding of the situation, Mr. President. So that the context of moving those 7 households from Murphy Pasture in order to ensure that we can relocate them and address the issues that they are facing speaks also very fundamentally to the question that was asked, Mr. President, on this floor, in this chamber earlier. What type of government are we? What type of government are we? And I'm suggesting to you, Mr. President, in the context of this resolution, the government is saying to those households, those men and women in Murphy Pasture, and also right throughout Barbados, that this government understands that economic transformation, understands that as we try to address the issues of the economy, that we have to be careful that we bring Barbadians along. We have to be careful that we listen to and take care of the very concerns of Barbadians. That yes, as we've heard on this floor, Mr. President, that we are going after and driving for investment, that we also understand the importance of addressing the situations of the vulnerable within our society. Because, Mr. President, the issue of flooding in Murphy Pasture is not just an issue of, yes, water will come and that those residents will have some level of discomfort. It's more than that. As I talked about it before, Mr. President, it's about well-being. It's about comfort. But there's also an objective situation, Mr. President, of the fact that where you have water and flooding, you also have mosquitoes, you will also have rodents, and that will also impact the health of those residents. Mr. President, you and I, and most of us in here, I can't speak to everybody's situation, but I'm going to assume, will leave from here and go into our homes of relative comfort, where we don't have to necessarily worry about the extent to which perhaps water will come and rain will fall and our belongings will be wet and soggy. We don't have to necessarily, Mr. President, worry about the extent to which we will not be sure that when we open our doors that we are not walking into floods of water. We don't have those worries. And very often, because for those of us who don't have those worries, we forget that there are others in Barbados who are living in situations, Mr. President, that directly affect their well-being as a fundamental right, because housing is a fundamental right, Mr. President. And like I said before, not just any type of housing, but quality housing. And this government is saying, Mr. President, this resolution, in the context of the housing revolution, that this government is intent on, that we fully understand the nexus between housing and also creating resilience in communities, the nexus between housing and well-being, the nexus between housing and helping people to adapt to climate change as well by making sure that we have solutions for adaptation as well. It is demonstrating that we understand the nexus, Mr. President, between breaking generational cycles of poverty and housing. That if we can ensure that those households that are impacted, yes, by flooding, but also impacted by the possibility of having their health impacted, that are also impacted by their well-being, being negatively impacted by their situation, that if we can move those households out, that what we are doing is lifting households as well out of a situation and creating a new environment as well that immediately causes all of them to be able to look at life differently. And if we don't understand that, Mr. President, it's because, again, those of us that are in relatively good comfort may have forgotten that that very old Bajan thing about owning that piece of the rock and what that means to us fundamentally, about turning that key, but also as well how much we take pride in our homes and in our surroundings, because it means something to us. It says something about us. It makes us feel good. And we have to be sure, Mr. President, that in the context of our housing policy, that we are giving those that are most vulnerable the exact same opportunities to have the exact same sense of pride in their surroundings and where they live as those of us who are in relatively good comfort have the opportunity to do. Mr. President, in the context of examining the conditions of those persons within Murphy-Pasteur, we realize as well that there are communities still in Barbados that have pit toilets. And again, Mr. President, we become uncomfortable in the context of what we know and perceive to be the modern Barbados, to come to terms with the fact that we still have communities that have pit toilets. And I want to say, Mr. President, that I am also going to suggest that there's also a judgment about those communities and households and families where you find those pit toilets. Why? How come? Them can't get running water. What happening? But it is in those contexts, Mr. President, that the state has a responsibility to its citizens to be able to step in, Mr. President, and be able to create the environment for those residents, for those communities, in order to be able to flourish. It is the responsibility of this government, it is the commitment of this government to do this. Because we understand, again, Mr. President, the linkage between having households that have that sense of pride and their ability as well to be able to contribute. Mr. President, there was a study by UN ECLAC in September of 2022, and it was looking at this issue of affordable housing in the region. And that study noted that inadequate and poor housing is a contributing factor to the intergenerational reproduction of poverty. It also identified, Mr. President, that poor housing and inadequate housing and the environs in which such housings are found is one of the clear gaps that identifies an expression of inequality, and reflect long-standing development gaps between those who live in middle and high-income formal neighborhoods and those living in poor or informal settlements. That study, Mr. President, also suggested that addressing this gap is crucial to building a more just society and cannot be decoupled from sustainable development ambitions, Mr. President. That statement within itself says to us, again, as I've been saying, that the issue that this resolution is attempting to address is far deeper than just moving a couple of people from one location to the other. But that as a country, if we are committed fundamentally to sustainable development and to the sustainable development goals and understand the interlinkage that the sustainable development goals have, then we are able to clearly see that the government is trying to undertake a comprehensive solution to address a problem. Mr. President, the government could go in and it could attempt another fix to the flooding problem. It could build a wider canal than the one that was built at 2 feet, 2 by 2. Yeah, 2 feet, 2 feet, 2 feet wide, 2 feet deep. Yeah, it can attempt to do that. But the government in its analysis didn't just only look at the issue of the flooding. And the report, Mr. President, from the Urban Development Corporation looked not only at what are the causes of the flooding and how can we alleviate it, but fundamentally, it also looked at what are the living conditions of these residents. What are the living conditions of these residents? And so that the relocation is also about ensuring that we can provide these households with housing solutions, and I'm going to always use the word that I use, that are fit, Mr. President, fit for purpose in the context of providing the level of comfort, Mr. President, or providing the level of household resilience and well-being that is necessary. It is also, Mr. President, part of government's wider urban rejuvenation program. It cannot be delinked, Mr. President, because very often we like to think in silos. The government is doing this housing resolution, and the government is also fixing this problem over here. But really and truly, the attempt in our policy matrix, Mr. President, is to make sure that we provide and create an ecosystem, particularly for the most vulnerable in our societies, to be able to survive, and not just survive, because very often we want to treat to the most vulnerable sometimes, Mr. President, in a way in which we can give them something and let them be comfortable. This government is saying no. This government recognizes the need to create that ecosystem. It is for that reason, Mr. President, that we are also reforming the welfare system, Mr. President. It is for that reason, Mr. President, that we are also, as well, having a training revolution that can be ensured that persons can be employed, and we were talking about it, Mr. President, before, to take up some of the specialty jobs through the government itself, bearing the cost of providing the inputs so that we can ensure that we can bring everybody along with us. The idea of urban renewal and urban rejuvenation is also about ensuring that in the context of inner city and urban areas, that we are able to create environments that change people's outlook, that provide people with a different way of seeing their reality through a simple thing of providing housing. And so in the context, Mr. President, of how this government is intended to allocate its scarce resources, resolutions such as this become a priority for the government. It is as much a priority as anything that we have done. Because, Mr. President, there is a clear understanding of the need to ensure that we lift Barbadians. And in the context of this particular resolution, those households in the context of Murphy Pasture that have been continually suffering from this problem. That then we are able not just to go in to tinker, not just to go in to put a plaster, but that we addressed not just the problem of the flooding, but we also address the higher level and more structural issue of the standard of living, Mr. President. Mr. President, I close by suggesting to this honourable chamber, as I've done at the start, that we ought to see this resolution in a wider framework. A wider framework, as I started, Mr. President, in the context of climate change. Because if this government does not address this issue for these residents and for others through its housing revolution, we will then have a greater level of impact. All of the analysis suggests that we will have greater levels of floods, more severe hurricanes, more adverse impacts from climate change. So we cannot afford, Mr. President, to continue to have residents in areas such as these exposed and left to address the issue on their own, but that this government is demonstrating who we are in relation to how we see our people and where they must go in terms of development. Mr. President,
Speakers? Senator Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Was trying very hard to resist the temptation to be anecdotal. I confess that I have failed. I grew up in the city, sir. As you know, I don't think that a lot of people know. And therefore, the city, urban Barbados, I grew up on Baxter's Road. Urban Barbados is very close to me. And the development and upliftment of communities in urban Barbados is something about which I was passionate. And in fact, sir, when I came to active politics in choosing a constituency, not only did I choose, I made some very deliberate decisions. When I went to St. James South, I had been asked by a number of constituencies to consider running. I chose St. James South because it had never been won by the Labour Party in the history of politics in Barbados, and I felt that it was partly because we had never chosen a really young candidate who was prepared to stay in there and keep fighting, and was prepared to lose a couple times on the road to victory. I'm pleased to say that that strategy worked, and I did become the MP on my second attempt. And I'm saying that to aspiring politicians in here or elsewhere. The first time that I ran, I was beaten 5-1, which is perhaps one of the worst political beatings that you could get. I was not deterred because I was determined that I was going to serve the people of St. James South and the Barbados Labour Party. And I went on to become the MP for St. James South. I chose St. James South because it had as well, not only was it a microcosm of the socio-economic makeup of Barbados, but it had a large urban sprawl across Halls and Durance Village, which to some extent had more of a profile of rural villages, and then the large community of Haynesville, because I wanted to give service in urban Barbados. I remember, and I've started broad and I'm bringing it closer to Murphy's Pasture, sir. In the 1970s, when drainage in the city was extremely bad, when there was very poor guttering, when in the days, sir, and I know that you lived in rural Barbados, and therefore, like my own experience, yours would have been, and indeed some senators, honourable senators in here, that very few people had televisions. There was little electrification, very poor bus services, not a lot of pipe-borne water. And when you walk the street at night in darkness, the very few people who had television would stand out because the glow would come from the door or from the window, and people in the community would be standing at the window, peeping in, watching the few TV shows. I think TV went off at maybe 6 or 7 o'clock. And when the householders who had the fortune of the television got tired of people looking in their house, they would close the door, the window, and you would have to find your way home. All of that has been part of my life experience, sir. And I remember having to write an essay when I was in primary school before going on to secondary school about the very bad floods of October 1970. And I remember it because I was living on Baxter's Road. And because all of Murphy Pasture, all the Earlines, as we call it, floodway, sir. And I saw with my eyes, and hope never to see again, fishermen in Moses on the streets of Baxter's Road and in the Orleans, rescuing people from the windows of houses. Saw it with my eyes, sir. Moses on the streets of the city. That is the history to flooding in Murphy Pasture. And I'm saying it because we come in here and we talk in the abstract, but we do not understand the history and the life experience. And this, I'm a child, 9, 10 years old. October 1970, I would have been 9 years old. Watching this, terrified as water is flooding the street. And there are these fishermen coming through with these boats, taking people out of the windows of their houses, little children, putting them into the boats and taking them off, all through the city. And I remember when Billy Miller, Dame Billy now, ran for the city and started to talk about things like canalization of Murphy Pasture and the Orleans, of proper drainage. I started to hear her talking about Bridgetown being below sea level, and I'm saying, what she mean? You go to the sea, how you mean it below sea level? Not fully appreciating the context of climate change and what it meant to have low-lying areas in the city. So a lot of transformation work has gone on. In fact, in Jeanette, the only people, or the only person to die, died in the city of Bridgetown from flooding in Jeanette of 1955. So Bridgetown is a city below sea level, with a history of severe flooding that has warranted policy responses that have made a difference to people's lives and transformed the context of urban Barbados, the appearance of the city, and the quality of life and housing in the city. So people who know London Board Towers and Kensington Lodge and all of these housing developments that came under previous BLP administration do not understand the kind of rapid and substantive transformation that took place with Billy Miller as MP. And she used to say, sir, that she went to bed every night with the Bridgetown redevelopment plan in bed with her, and that when she turned in the morning after saying her prayers, her next point of reference was the Bridgetown redevelopment plan. You, Mr. President, and I would have lived hearing that from Dame Billy for the longest time, but she had a vision for the city that I must confess I've not really heard articulated by any MP before or since her, in terms of how she was going to transform the physical space, the urban space, the quality of life, the housing, the drainage, the roads, bringing activity into the city, creating points of interest, beautifying the city, and a lot of the physical development work of transformation has to be attributable to her. And I'm saying that, sir, because we wait till people are gone to sing their praises, but really she deserves very high praise. So I am happy to see that the work of the Barbados Labour Party in transforming St. Michael, urban Barbados, but in particular the city, and that a stone's throw from where I grew up, that these 7 houses are going to be moved to improve their conditions because they are still extremely vulnerable in times of severe flooding and extreme bad weather. And I want to make the point, sir, I want to locate my comments again under this in the context of climate change. While we are moving these particular householders and this block of the community, we really have to consider what is going to be our own national adaptation plan and response to the issue of climate change. Because it isn't just these houses on Murphy Pasture. The reality is that many islands in the Pacific are sinking because of sea level rise. The reality is that Bridgetown is a low-lying coastal area with water coming into the center of the city itself, right up to what people call the Swing Bridge. The reality is that Barbados's major installation for police stations, radio stations, hospitals, whether it is at Black Rock, whether it is at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, are in major flood zone areas within a kilometer or so of the coastline. And if we have an extreme weather event, getting people to or from a hospital, the Queen Elizabeth, is going to be problematic. Getting people in and out of fire stations, getting people in and out of police stations and other critical response services because of their location. And it has to become part of our physical development planning when we look at our adaptation strategies, where we are going to put particular kinds of facilities, whether more of them are going inland, whether we are going to move them out of flood zones, how we are going to relocate and plan for the future, because not only is climate change real, it is advancing at a rapid pace. And already, people don't realize it. People talk about the boardwalk and how beautiful it is, but the boardwalk was a climate change response. It was an engineering solution to the substantial erosion and loss of the South Coast beaches, and what that meant for the communities there, for property owners there, and for our tourism product on the South Coast. Because let us understand, we have the West Coast tourists, and we have the South Coast tourists, and the two are very different types of tourists looking for different types of accommodation in terms of cost, in terms of social activity and relaxation. The tourists on the West Coast tends to be older, more affluent, more sedentary, given to certain types of lifestyles, whereas the South Coast tend to be younger, more racy bunch, looking for more activity, less affluent, etc., etc. They're the ones that are going into Chefette on the coast. They're the ones going into Kentucky. They are the ones eating by cuz when did they come. They are not the ones dining at the Cliff or QP. They are not the ones at Tides. Different market altogether. And therefore, if we were to protect that component of our tourism market, all the jobs that went with it, we had to engineer the solution. And I smile, and I think I've made the observation in here before, that as minister, I had to fight very hard, because a lot of the people who are now applauding and talking about what a great project it is were deeply opposed to it and refused to give permission for us to pass the boardwalk across small parcels of land. We heard all about the old thieves that we were going to be bringing to break in the place when the night come, that they would lose their privacy, all kinds of things. It is now in the past. It bears the name of Sir Richard, and we are all pleased with the kinds of social and recreational activity, with the beautification, with the way it has created greater access to properties and revenue and other opportunities for other people. But once again, I'm framing the history, because either we don't tell it or we forget it. So I'm framing the history. So that we have to consider, and on the South Coast, there are also a number of pit toilets. The Honourable Minister in her presentation spoke about the socio-economic impacts of pit toilets, what it means for lives of dignity or not having access to full dignity when you know that Barbados is a country that has principally waterborne toilets and you are still living in a using the kind of toilet or sanitary facilities that characterizes a bygone era in this modern time. And our policy to transform that and to change that for people still living in those conditions has legitimacy and must be implemented with alacrity. But let us understand that this is part of a problem of drainage and how we are going to plan for drainage with the onset of climate, which means greater floods, higher levels of desertification, sea level rise, which means things like sargassum seaweed and so on. And I'm going to make a point about that in a hurry, in a little while. So that because we have all of these critical installations in areas where they are at risk, and let us understand that there is a cost to this. We are in here talking about effecting a change that will help people significantly. But let us also accept that there is a cost to doing it. The World Bank has identified the Caribbean as the second most disaster-prone region in the world. In addition, Barbados and the Caribbean is the most debt-burdened region in the world. So when you consider that, and the cost of climate change, adaptation, and mitigation, then you understand why at Egypt we pushed for loss and damage. And let me explain these expressions, because we use them thinking that everybody is on board with them. And the truth is, they don't necessarily understand. Mitigation is when you use technology to reduce or avert a climate impact. For instance, using the boardwalk to protect your coastline, technology to mitigate. Adaptation is when if you were planning a hotel, for instance, and you know that there is going to be flooding on the beach, then you may reset your hotel baseline back an additional 20 feet or something of the sort. That is adapting to a change that you know is happening as a consequence of climate. And the concept of loss and damage really says that there are some impacts of climate that are so severe that you cannot mitigate against them, nor can you adapt to them. And therefore, you are incurring losses. Let us take the instance of sargassum seaweed, which we believe is a consequence of not sea level rise, but warming ocean temperatures, creating the ambient conditions for the proliferation of this seaweed. It is affecting your fishing stocks. It is smothering your coral reefs. It is forcing your fishermen to go further out to get catches, so that you are seeing amberfish or amberjacks, but not flying fish, All of this is loss and damage. Somebody is suffering loss. There is damage here that the government cannot plan for, cannot finance, cannot adapt to, and cannot mitigate against. That is what we mean by loss and damage. And when we speak then about the establishment of a fund in Egypt or at the Egyptian COP for loss and damage, it is a recognition that the behavior and lifestyles of the developed world is causing such severe consequences in a climate crisis that others are pushed onto the front line and are unable to afford. Because you cannot finance your development agenda if you are constantly forced to finance a climate crisis, whether it is severe flooding, whether it is the loss of roofs and houses in a freak storm, whether it is building high-cost engineering barriers to ensure you don't lose your beaches. There is a cost to the climate crisis, and that is why developing countries were saying there has to be loss and damage. We have to be compensated for it. We have to get monies to address this issue. So I'm trying to frame it in the context of the people down in Murphy Pasture who now have to be relocated because flooding. We've had severe rains in Barbados, continuous, heavy, all day, can't get out kind of rains. Because of that sort of thing, those people are subject to horrible living conditions, the constant flooding. Those who would have had pit toilets are having bad odors or problems from overflow of wells and so on. When you start to dig in the city, sometimes depending on where you are located, you get to slushy water very, very quickly. There's a cost to that. And therefore, when people ask, why go to Egypt? This is why, that there is a cost to not going. There is a cost to going, yes. There's a benefit to going, yes. But there is a greater cost to not going if we cannot be there to put our case and ensure that we get resources to help the people down in Murphy Pasture and in other areas of Barbados who are the victims of climate change. So let us make the connections. This is not gallivanting. This is not an academic exercise. It isn't about traveling for the sake of traveling. It is about traveling to protect the interests of the people of Barbados. And so as we try to move to a modern Barbados where we put an end to pit toilets, where people have access to good quality homes and good quality public housing, we have to look at this issue of drainage, of greater canalization, of determining the floodplains and how we deal with them appropriately. But this also raises another issue, because the area to which these persons, these householders are going to be located, close then to the Kensington Oval area and in those adjoining and environs, is an area like much of Barbados, urban Barbados, where there are multiple vacant lots and houses. In a situation where you have a waiting list at National Housing of 20,000 people looking for housing units all over Barbados, particularly in urban Barbados, particularly in St. Michael, you have vacant lots and units. And let's understand the social history. It happens when families go away and some members don't come back. It happens when land or property is passed seed to seed without any proper title deeds, and the prospective owner cannot really take ownership of the property because they don't have title deeds. It happens when there are disputed estates and families are fighting over land and property, Miriam paying the land tax because John ain't helping and all of this kind of thing. Not you, Senator. These are the kinds of situations. So you have, and particularly in places like Bank Hall, Queen Mary Road and King this road and all of these roads where you had a highbrow middle class of the 60s and 70s. People who worked as clerkesses, as Bajans used to call them, in stores and in banks, when people who looked like me could never get a job at a bank. No matter how bright you were, too black. You just did not fit the profile of the front-facing officer in the bank. You just didn't. And those persons, a lot of them, some lived out in Strathclyde and areas all along Bank Hall and certain parts of Bush Hall. And you see them sometimes, what would once have been very elegant properties have gone into decline as the families have gone into genteel and sometimes not so genteel poverty as their circumstances have changed. Because that was an era when their color alone would have ushered them into a certain kind of job and into a certain income level and status, and the family did not stay trained as things changed. They didn't keep their wealth, so they couldn't hold on to their properties and so on. And a lot of them now, a lot of these properties have seen better days or are vacant or falling apart or overgrown with weeds and so on. And sometimes the Ministry of Health puts up notices to demolish them because of their very poor state. We have, Mr. President, sir, I know both you and I, as former housing ministers, and had developed plans to bring a lot of these lots and houses into active use by approaching the landowners, and a whole policy was developed for dealing with them. I believe that that was one of the victims of the former administration, and you know, they crossed over it and said, rest in peace. Meanwhile, people continued to struggle for absence of housing and homes or appropriate lots. And here we are again, trying to deal with the same thing, and the current Ministry of Housing now planning to develop some plan to deal with it. And I say, let us not reinvent the wheel. Pick back up the old cabinet paper and the policy proposal, elements of which are relevant, valid, and strong still, and suitable to be implemented now, and let that guide the new process. But there has to be a way where, in a small island developing state of such small land size, that we have an active housing program which brings derelict properties and vacant lots into good, sustainable use for the benefit of those who need proper housing, and housing of a particular quality to give dignity to their lives. Far too often, you see people in the newspapers complaining about the conditions in which slumlords have them living, or the fact that the house that they're in is in poor repair and they have to pay the rent, or the landlord puts them out, but the landlord did nothing. I know that there are some tenants who really take advantage of the landlords too. I mean, no doubt about that. But let us try to deal with housing as a comprehensive tool for upward social transformation and for ensuring that Barbados becomes the largest property owning democracy in the region of the Caribbean. There had been a loan negotiated with the IDB for urban redevelopment, and we had identified a number of communities in St. Michael East, in the city, even one in St. James South that people would not even realize have been there, that all had the same characteristics. St. Thomas, yes. And really, I don't know where we are with that loan, whether we are paying commitment fees on it, whether... Oh, I'm now being told that the last administration canceled it, and they like to parade as the party of the poor and the poor black man, but they didn't think that the poor black man needed any proper housing. So you have a loan negotiated with IDB to upgrade all of these areas in St. Michael, where people are living in subhuman conditions, and they cancel the loan. I do not know why they don't speak about these things and how their maladministration affected not just the economy and society as a broad construct, but really impacted in a negative and serious way, whether it was in not paying for people's education to denying them housing. The average Barbadian suffered because of the poor quality of government that we saw under the Democratic Labour Party, and that they have the gall to be prancing up every time they perceive that there is a minor error. I want to tell them to prance down, because the facts, when they are presented to them about how cancelling an IDB loan that will allow for housing upgrade, for community upgrade, for dignity, for development, I want them to prance up on that. The so-called party for the poor and small black man. Because their policy is to keep people small and poor. Now, I know we can't stop them from being black, but it has never been the policy of the Barbados Labour Party to keep them small or poor. It has never been our policy to ensure that we keep people dependent on us for handouts, but to give them dignity, education for upward mobility, and to put policies in place which transform their social circumstances. So insofar as we see remaining these major pockets of poverty characterized by poor housing, which we see generations of cycles of generations of poverty, we need to intervene and break that. We need to intervene and break that, so that the lives of the families so affected are transformed. I want then, sir, as I look toward a landing zone, since we talked about aviation later in the day, to make just a couple more points. I would want to make two suggestions. While many of these ideas and policy intentions are good, strong, worthy, and worthwhile, we must not fall down on the matter of implementation. We must not fall down on the matter of implementation. And therefore, I welcome the creation by the Prime Minister of senior ministers responsible for broad areas and oversight of these to help to accelerate and strengthen implementation. At the same time, it is my view that we need a connection between the political policy oversight and the administration level. And it seems to me that that can only come if we appoint a supra PS, a person who is responsible for the liaison between the senior ministers or among senior ministers, who will then engage individual PSs across the spectrum to determine how fast we are going on the agenda, or if we are moving too slowly. It is of concern to me, and I hear that some PSs do not routinely go through the manifesto with ministers to check off what is done, what is not done, what is outstanding, what is the time frame, developing Gantt charts and targets, so that you get your agenda done, because time goes very quickly in a political cycle. And therefore, the administration, the implementation have to be strengthened. Otherwise, you can find as a government that you have exceptional policy ideas, but you are not getting them implemented at the rate, in the manner that you want, or at all. The second suggestion I would want to make arises out of my own experience, having had to do a major relocation in the city when I was housing minister. In order, and it was one that had to be done extremely rapidly because we had to clear the space, a community, in order to expand the Kensington Oval for the Cricket World Cup. Can't remember the year. At the time, 2007, at the time, we moved people from houses that were not the best quality and to a community and still within the city community, still within the constituency of the city, so they were not far from home, but yeah, at Barbary Hill, where we created a beautiful green space with lovely trees, nice roads, and it really was an upgrade on what existed before. But had you listened to the radio commentaries or to the news, read the newspapers, one would have believed that we were uprooting these people, throwing them into substandard housing somewhere in the back, behind God's back. And therefore, you can do the right thing for the right reason and still not get the credit and the kudos for it, because the public discussion is being driven by people who have an agenda, a reason to oppose, a reason to make you look bad, etc. So there was, in the public domain, if you had seen the community before, some of the houses, and then if you saw what they were relocated to and how the community was substantially improved, you would not have gotten that from the press. And I am saying, therefore, that part of what we need to do when we do, and I don't know if it is done. If it is, I apologize for making a suggestion of something that might already be in place. But there are a number of projects, of housing projects that government has, whether it's going to be at White Hill in St. Andrew, whether it is going to be here now at Murphy Pasture, that often residents hear these things on the radio, from debates. We don't go into the communities and talk enough with the residents, explain, and again, I mean, when we were doing the South Coast Sewerage Project, people were complaining about disruption. I don't know how you would put a South Coast Sewerage Project in place that is protecting the whole country unless there is some element of disruption. The roads have to be dug up, connections have to be made to people's houses. So any project of this sort, of necessity, entails disruption. It means that people have to move from a space that they have become used to, even if you think it is a horrible place to live. It means that people are moving from their homes. It means that a community is being impacted, and there has to be conversation with these people, not necessarily by the Ministry of Housing going in and having a town hall meeting, even though that is desirable. The MPs have to walk around, and we have to establish, or here's my suggestion, community liaison officers. Train them properly to engage with communities in these circumstances, to understand the social and psychological impacts of moving, to deal with people's fears, to give them details of the project, because sometimes you think you talk to a person in a community meeting or in a town hall meeting, and the truth is they have not grasped everything that you were saying because they've been on the phone, because the person next to them talking, because the children misbehaving and they're telling them, stop, behave yourself every minute. They're just not listening. Or because sometimes officials are speaking in language that people in the community do not fully understand. Or because we are not explaining what it is they are really interested in. Or because they are embarrassed to get up in a crowd and ask a question. And therefore, if you have community liaison officers who can engage directly with households, with members of the community on a one-on-one, hear their questions, answer their questions, take them back to the ministry, come back with an answer, and you can rotate these community liaison officers through various projects. They can work on contract. You don't have to expand the civil service or the state-owned enterprise by a large number of people. It is possible to do these things and to do them well. But in the spirit of transparency, improved communication, and greater engagement with those whom we serve, and improved governance, I think that a mechanism like a community liaison officer would really serve to very effectively deal with some of the challenges and the problems. Often, in the absence of somebody to talk to, you call the general manager of a state-owned enterprise a few times, they don't return your call. You figure the only way you can get attention for your grievance or get your question answered is if you call the media or the call-in programs. Call the media, call the call-in programs. Same thing. Whereas if you were engaging the community, they would not be so agitated and would not feel that they have no recourse but to go to the media or to social media to deal with the issue. So I hope that this project will be executed well, that we will treat the people with courtesy and explain not just to the people who are moving, but to those who are remaining, how they are going to be impacted by the execution of the project, because if properties are being pushed down and so on, clearly it is going to impact the community, and you are dividing up a community. Some people are leaving the only home that they would have known for a long time. So I speak in support of this change. I'm happy to see this continuing development of the city during the course of my lifetime. I think I will always be a city person at heart. I hope one of these days that I hear about all these condos that are to be built on the waterfront all around the Careenage and heading up Bay Street and so on. I hope that they will not have so many knots behind their price that I'm unable to afford one, and that I can one day move in to a little 1 or 2 bedroom. So in a few years when I retire, I can move into a 1 or 2 bedroom condo, put up my foot on my balcony and watch the boats go by, and I would be in my life as I grew up, sir, in the city of Bridgetown. I'm much obliged to you, sir.
Thank you, Senator Thompson. Senator Angeli Boyce.
Thank you for recognizing me, Mr. President. I will admit that it is difficult to speak after Senator Thompson. But let us hope that fortune favors the brave. Mr. President, the resolution before the House is about those 7 families at Murphy's Pasture and relocating them and giving them dignity, as we have heard, and giving them dignity out of a situation where that very dignity has been compromised, not by any act of their own, but by the circumstances of our climate, Mr. President. But even as we contemplate the resolution before the House and the particulars of it, moving those individuals, we must locate that move in the context as part of the strategy of development in this country, Mr. President. And it is my view, and it is the view of this government, that development ought to be equitable. The definition of development as practiced by this government includes all of us, Mr. President. It is not development for some and not the others. And it is why we are effecting this move, I think, in the context of a broader rejuvenation of Bridgetown. A rejuvenation of Bridgetown, Mr. President, that, as we debated a couple weeks ago, will see new uses to the Treasury building. A rejuvenation of Bridgetown that we have already seen the development of green spaces and the use of those spaces for recreational and entertainment uses, Mr. President. And and the proposed continued development that will include changes to Queen's Park, bringing the National Cultural Foundation to that site and bringing life to the city as a space for art and creative expression, Mr. President. But while we do all of that, it is important to stop for a moment and to consider the realities of persons who, for one reason or another, have not kept pace with the country's development. And not only stop and take measure of their circumstances, Mr. President, but do something about it. Commit to doing something about it. I speak about equitable development, Mr. President, because it is the only way that Barbados will live up to its promise of being a vibrant and inclusive democracy. The idea that you and I, because of the blessings of God, the particulars of our circumstance, are not challenged with particular things, and that there are others who are and must be assisted to make a living, to find dignity, Mr. President, and to live a life in which they self-actualize, in which they are safe, and which there is certainty, Mr. President. And so I commend the government for this initiative. I commend the government for its broader housing plan to construct 10,000 houses. I commend the government and the Cabinet of Barbados for their commitment that 10% of the housing stock will go to persons with disabilities, Mr. President. All of this, part of that vision of equitable development and commitment to equitable development. I want to indicate that when we talk about the rejuvenation of Bridgetown, bringing life to the city, I want to implore the powers that be to ensure that as they build and as they construct, that they consider the realities of persons with disabilities. And that they make easy and accessible the ability to traverse the city independently, Mr. President, and that they consider the principles of universal design, principles that make the environment accessible for all of us, irrespective of physical or cognitive ability. This is not, and I say generally, that development is not a theoretical concept concept. It is not an esoteric concept. For these families in Murphy's Pasture, it means that they will get to go home and not be concerned when the rain falls about the wetting of the soaking of their belongings, the flooding of their homes, Mr. President. And imagine with me the comfort that one derives from that. Imagine with me the other things that your brain can do, the ease that you can walk through the day with if you don't have to worry about whether when you get home you will have a dry place to put your head, Mr. President. The productivity that may ensue if you get to walk through the day, a rainy day, without having to think when I get home if, my bed will be wet or not. And similarly, it is not an esoteric or abstract concept for persons with disabilities to conceive of themselves as independent, to wish that they could and want to traverse our capital city independently, comfortably, and with the necessary accommodations, Mr. President. I wish to also say in that regard that the government cannot do it alone. And perhaps I will take this opportunity to implore the private sector to commit as well, to see the value in universal design, to see the value in making Bridgetown as a city, the most accessible city anywhere in the Caribbean. There's an economic value, Mr. President, and there's a human value. And very often when we talk about the economic value of things like accessible cities, we talk about them in the context of tourism. I do not. While tourism is our business and it is the country's top earner, Mr. President, and it would be fantastic to see tourists arrive and have access to the capital city easily. I think about it in the context of the people who live here, the citizens of this country, who for a long time have not benefited from infrastructure that meets their needs as people with disabilities, and for a long time have not benefited from accessible spaces, Mr. President. And let me say that I commend the government for establishing the Committee on Improving the Lives of Persons with Disabilities, and infrastructure is a signal part of the work that is being done through that committee and in the crafting of legislation and in the crafting of policy. But Mr. President, in some ways we have to change the culture of this country. We have to appreciate, away from the law and away from the policy, we have to appreciate that each member of our society has a vision for themselves, and a vision that includes independent living, that includes accessibility, and that includes equitable development, Mr. President. I want to again recognize that this is not just about those 7 families at Murphy's Pasture, Mr. President. It is about the sustainability and the resilience of our capital city. And I implore the government in its move to equitably develop the country to find the pockets of poverty, to find the pockets where people endure conditions that we struggle to imagine as people who don't live in them, to find them wherever they are and to make them better, Mr. President. I support this resolution wholeheartedly and commend the government for its continued work at making Barbados a more equitable place to live, work, and to do business. Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Boyce. Senator Minard.
Mr. President, I will be brief. Thank you. Mr. President, whenever I heard the words flooding mentioned in this chamber, I feel obliged to rise and stand and speak about flooding or potential flooding in the QEH. And it is something, Mr. President, that is a constant threat. The government has spent large sums of money dredging, expanding, and beautifying the Constitution River. I don't believe that it's being used to its full extent, except for the gentlemen who race model boats on Sunday evenings. I don't see anyone else using it. So I hope there's a big tourist plan for it. But, Mr. President, the problems of flooding in the QEH have not gone away. And we spoke time and time again about storm surge and the implications for the hospital, because it's the only tertiary care hospital that we have. And the government, under the hardest of conditions some years ago, came up with $11 million to build an extension onto the A&E department. And sadly, it's only half finished. So we're no further forward than when we started. I can speak confidently to that only the intention was to expand the A&E, and it has not been truly expanded because the older part of the building that was really refurbishment was completed has not been completed. So you only have the new part of the A&E, which is already falling apart in a lot of ways. Now, if you start wrong, you'll end wrong. The problems of flooding in this country, Mr. President, are partly, unfortunately, Murphy's Pasture might be suffering consequences of modern development and pre-existing problems with its location. But a lot of the problems of flooding in this country are directly related to some of the development that we've allowed in different places and allow people to change water courses. You've seen it on Highway 2A, where if you drive across by Bagatelle on a rainy night, you might drown because you don't know where the road ends or it begins, because some people were allowed to stop the water course and put in a few wells. Yes, if you, Madam Deputy President, if you really rack your memory, you might remember the time. I will not say when. You spent millions of dollars in Whole Town. A shower fell recently, and what happened? Same problem. Unless you fix the problems upstream, the problems downstream will continue. yes, the efforts in Murphy Pasture is just a continuation of what government wants to do. And is doing it well and moving people away from areas where they're exposed to unnecessary risk and trying to improve the standard of their living. But the Deputy President spoke about in a very desirable way about the option of moving into a condominium, possibly in Bridgetown. But Mr. President, most of the condominiums built in this country, the normal, ordinary people like myself can't afford them. Because, Mr. President, the prices are so high, Mr. President, we can't afford them. And I listened to the Deputy President say that she wished that she could afford one. Even the Deputy President is the same problem. Because, Mr. President, there is no limit now. And it's not only the condominiums that people build privately. A few years ago, there were developments in Valerie, in Bridgetown, and the Grotto. And if you look at the cost of those units, one has to ask, who were they built for? Who were they built for? The prices were absolutely ridiculous. So, on one hand, we have to ask, when government is spending the people's money to build housing units, are we really getting value for money? Are we really getting value for money? We had a little hurricane that caused lots of damage, and there were all sorts of efforts made to help people by reconstructing houses, building new houses, importing houses. And I asked, well, have people moved into the houses? What's the update on these houses? Because a lot of money's been spent. Where's the update? The money's been spent, so have people moved in? I have driven around. I have not seen a light on in any of the houses that were assembled yet. So I have to ask in this parliament, what's happened to the houses? Pardon me? I keep looking, Mr. President, at these houses that were being built, these imported houses that were supposed to help people and move people in. I don't see any activity at night. I don't see lights on. So I assume there's no activity. Now, Mr. President, I want to comment on something. A few months ago, I saw a notice in the newspaper. It was a government notice, a pre-qualification notice, where it stated that contractors had to qualify to submit to be on a list of approved contractors for a new geriatric hospital. I was very happy about that because we do need one. And it was going to be built in the National Botanical Gardens. Not by the Ministry of Health, but I think it was the BTMI? It was a tourism, TTBI, and a tourism-linked organization, Mr. President. But what really disturbed Mr. President is that in this pre-qualification notice, it said that you had to have done work worth over $3 million, I think it was, or over $7 in the last 3 years. Not as a subcontractor, but as a full contractor. And I ask, how does this government, in these times, find eligible contractors, local contractors to build, who would have had $3 million in work? The Deputy President qualified it as black contractors. Thank you. I forgot to say that. Now, there are subcontractors who have done $7,000 in work, but they can't qualify. And this government has now seen to it that they still cannot qualify by putting that notice in the paper because they were subcontractors. You had to have done the work as a primary contractor. So, Mr. President, if you're going to talk the talk, we have to walk it too. Now, Mr. President, this notion that forevermore we will have large contractors who will then subcontract the small contractors who can survive is a joke. The largest employer for the big contracts is government. Government spends the people's money that it collects as taxes. But it's interesting. I can speak personally to this because I'm aware of it. There's a large building being built in Bridgetown for a government department. The subcontractor employed on that site was offered rates for work that by the time they finished the work at each stage, from foundation, for the steel work, for the concrete which the contractor supplies, they will lose money on each stage. Mr. President, that is modern day slavery. It's a topic which you don't want to speak of, but it's called slavery. In the old days, you had to own the slave, feed the slave, clothe the slave. Unless they got sick, maybe you give them some medicine too. No, you don't have to do that. That example says, the slave has to get his own house, own clothes, feed himself. But if he has to work and he loses money on the job, not because of bad management, but because the rates that you offer are subpar. In a government contract, we have to ask ourselves, how is government choosing its contractors for the jobs? Because it is modern day slavery in a different form. So when we speak about building new houses and expanding it, building 10,000 houses in a time period for people to move into, we have to ask, who's making the profit? And are the people who build these houses, are they really able to improve their standard when they get the work and build a house?
On a point of order, Mr. President, sir, I hate to interrupt the Honourable Senator, but I think that the Honourable Senator is in danger of misleading the chamber because this is a potentially very controversial and sensational matter. It is an important one. It has to be addressed. I'm concerned how it could possibly be reported because I think in the languaging of his presentation, it may have been interpreted to mean that government was complicit in the pursuit of these practices of slavery. But the reality is that when government contracts, they are not necessarily familiar with the subcontractual arrangements and therefore the prices that are being paid unless the subcontractors protest, refuse, or complain to government that they're being taken advantage of. Government could have a contract and be totally unaware that this is what has transpired. And if this is in fact what is happening, it must be addressed. But I would not want it to be recorded anywhere that government is complicit in any practice of slavery, of modern day slavery or otherwise, because I know that the Honourable Senator did not intend to infer that government is deliberately doing this.
Thank you, Senator Thompson. Senator Miller.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I know in no way wish to imply that the government was complicit in anything of the sort. And I thank the Deputy President for seeking early to clarify it. Mr. President, be it as it may, it is something that needs to be looked into, Mr. President, because if we are going to improve the lot of all in the country, we have to do it equitably, Mr. President. Now, Mr. President, I wish to go back a little bit to the environs in Bridgetown and flooding. I'm told there was a major flood in Bridgetown and people lost their lives in the area of the Queen's Park and Halls Road. And large sums of money has indeed been spent, as I said earlier, on the drainage. But I've not heard any formal comments. And mind you, the last section of that improvement hasn't been officially opened yet, as far as I'm aware. I might be wrong, but as far as it hasn't been officially opened. Whether the expectation is that what happened back then shall not happen and cannot happen again, I don't know if you can really give that guarantee. But in the same way that we have moved persons from, or intend to move persons from Murphy pasture, I do not know if all the development has happened on Halls Road is really safe. Because the flooding, from what I'm told by my late mother-in-law, came well across the road and houses floated off the foundations. And I don't know if, yes, if the works that are done will ever stop it. What I can say is that, and I hope that the QEH is protected by all the money that we've spent in doing that work. It has its own problems from construction, Mr. President, but I hope it's protected, because if it isn't, and we get a flood, and there is flooding in the QEH, it means, Mr. President, that we've gone nowhere. And the same evacuation plan we had before, when there was flooding, where the accident and emergency had to move upstairs, might well still have to be in place. And we have to remember that the world is changing. And while you might have calculated for 18 inches of sea level rise, you might get 18 feet. We saw it, Mr. President, with Storm Surge in Florida. And I hope it never happens in Barbados. But it can happen. So all the improvements that we're making, Mr. President, we still have to be conscious and say, but we cannot guarantee you that it will not happen. I felt absolutely pleased about the work done in Whole Town. And to my horror, it still has a problem. So we have to tell the people, Mr. President, you do the work with all the engineering specs and all the advice, but there is no guarantee, and you have to be vigilant. You have to be vigilant. We can't say because we have done the work, it can't happen. You still have to be vigilant and make sure that you protect yourself. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Maynard. Senator Dr. Brathwaite.
Thank you, Mr. President, for recognizing me and giving me the opportunity to make a brief comment on the bill that has been presented to this chamber. Abraham Harold Maslow, a famous American psychologist, created the idea that we as human beings have a hierarchy of needs. From the bottom of his famous pyramid, he reasoned that we need food, shelter, and clothing. Then we need safety and security. Then we need love and a sense of belonging. And finally, we need self-esteem and self-actualization. He reasoned that the basic needs of human beings must be met at the lowest rungs of the pyramid before we can aspire to the higher needs of society and human endeavor. In the context of Maslow's theory, I believe that the basic needs of my people are for food, for shelter, for energy, and for health, before we can aspire to enjoy the higher levels of true independence and true self-actualization. If we're going to be a country that continues to be high on the Human Development Index of the United Nations system, and if we're going to continue to punch above our weight, we must provide decent shelter for the less privileged of our economy and our society. Those efforts to improve housing for the less privileged and to remove them from the scourge of poverty and poor living conditions must be applauded. I have said in a different presentation that one of our goals in this post-COVID development agenda must be the removal of poverty from our country, where we recognize that in the context of the world, in the context of developing countries, our level of poverty is relatively low when compared to many others. And according to the IDB report, it is just about 35,000 households, 35,000 individuals, 7,000 households, just about 7% of our population that is in this situation. I therefore applaud the efforts that are being made to improve housing. I support this bill as an effort to provide greater social equity in our society, to provide our people with better conditions of life, and to help us in that grand quest, in my opinion, to escape poverty in our country. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Brathwaite. Senator Dr. Moronek.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me thank all of the honourable senators in this chamber that have contributed to this debate. We've heard words of equity, decency, well-being, ensuring standard of living. Again, demonstrating the full understanding of this chamber that the resolution was much more than just about providing housing, but a clear elucidation of the nexus, Mr. President, between our sustainable development and this resolution and what the government is attempting to do. Mr. President, to respond to a couple of the concerns and queries and statements that have been made by the honourable members in respect of the debate on the resolution. I want to say to Madam Deputy Speaker that in relation to implementation, certainly this is one of the things that the government is keen to wrestle as much as possible. It is big. The notion of the implementation deficit is not something that anyone can suggest that is going to be able to do very easily. It's always going to be a work in progress. But what the government is attempting to do is, through a compendium of different actions, seek to set structures in place to be able to exactly do the monitoring and the follow-up and set the oversight. So the government has established what are called Directorate Generals, and they exist, these DGs, in several areas. There is a DG for governance, and that is essentially, as was indicated, a supra PS that operates above all of the other PSs in order to collate in order to give oversight to the government's agenda in relation to governance. There is a DG for the productive sector. There is a DG in relation to reform. There's a DG for the public service. Mr. President, on top of that, then we have the senior ministers as well. And the government is also intending to establish a national strategic council. And in that national strategic council, you will have the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, the senior ministers, along as well with all of the Director Generals, who will then be able to keep track of, as we've indicated, all of the major government initiatives, be able to have better account of what is happening, and also as well be able to send signals down through the public sector in terms of when things are off track, what needs to be prioritized, and what needs to be managed better. And then this is then also buttressed by the commitment for results process, which is a whole of government performance management framework that the government is also intended to put in place. So that, well, Mr. President, I want to say that I am not at all saying that we have all of the answers in relation to addressing the issue of implementation. I do want to signal that the government does have it front of mind and is seeking to make sure that it puts the necessary processes in place. And certainly one of the things that we're also ensuring that we're going to do is to also be reflective. That is that the establishment of structures are not going to be structures because we establish them and they will stay forever. But the intent is that we will always stress test, we'll always reflect on the extent to which these mechanisms and structures will do what it is that we intend for them to do. In respect of the recommendation that we perhaps establish community liaison officers, I do want to say again that in the context of the restructuring of the welfare department, certainly that is also one of the things, and when I say that is also one of the things that we're looking at, the whole notion of how do we ensure that we have a welfare system that is nimble and responsive, that it is not just about officers sitting behind a desk, but that officers are able to better interact with stakeholders, with clients, in a way that ensures that there is an actual touch point and a clear relationship. Of course, Mr. President, that exists now, but it is imperfect. So we need to deploy more officers in better ways. But the systems are working in order to be able to look at those processes and making sure that we can deploy. But certainly, Mr. President, taking on board the suggestion that we do need to ensure that we help people to transition as they have to move, as they experience that disruption, that we are able to help them to transition. Mr. President, Senator Andrele Boyce reminded us very frontally of this government's commitment to the disabled community in relation to making sure that there is provision for housing for those within the disabled community. And I want to say, as Senator Boyce also recognized, that again, this is top of mind for the government, and we see that, as was recognized as well, in the establishment of the committee that is looking to take on board recommendations and develop an action plan, not only in the context of solutions for housing, but in a whole of government framework. How do we make sure that we are responsive to the needs for inclusion? How do we make sure that at the level of our infrastructure that we are responsive? And even in the context of things like culture, because certainly we've had discussions with the committee that we are also responsive. So in the context, we are seeking to take a whole of government approach to addressing the concerns and challenges of the disabled community. And certainly we look forward to getting the report from that committee, and also as well to be working to roll out and to implement the many recommendations that we will hear forthcoming. Mr. President, Senator Maynard put some very serious considerations on the floor for us. And I want to speak just briefly to a couple of those. And perhaps the best response is Senator Maynard's own response, in that we can give no guarantees. The context of climate change is such that we can give no guarantees. The intensity, the force, the level, the speed at which we will, one, have to face the impact, but then also have to be able to respond, is a challenge for the government. That's why we are negotiating. That's why we are advocating. That's why the Prime Minister is speaking so strongly, because we recognize the challenge. We recognize that it is going to be difficult, Mr. President, to respond to all of the areas, including the issues of flooding, that we need to, at the pace that we need to. So that we need to be able, one, to generate resources in order to be able to answer and respond to the challenge, but also as well to call attention to the impacts that we are facing. And this is not, Senator Maynard, Mr. President, through to deny the fact that there are ongoing areas of work that needs to be attended to. I completely agree that the threat to the QEH, if we have a massive level of rainfall that produces extremely an extreme event of flooding, will have a severe implications. But I also want to acknowledge, as Senator Maynard has done, that the government is attempting to address the issue, that the government is attempting to make sure that it has the resources there, that it looks at the issue and attempts to alleviate it, Mr. President. So the work is ongoing in that respect, as it is ongoing in other areas, so that we are not always able in every single area at the same time, at the pace and the speed, again, because of the context that we are operating in. But certainly, all of the advocacy that we are doing in respect of climate change is about ensuring that we are able to address the issues, bring attention to it, and find the necessary resources. I want to remind this Honourable Chamber that it was this government who came in and said, we will wrestle to the ground the issues that were facing the South Coast, that bedeviled the previous administration. And the government made a commitment and worked assiduously in order to be able to bring some measure, some semblance of dignity to the residents of the areas and relief for the businesses. So that there is a commitment, Mr. President, in order to be able to address the concerns, the issues of flooding that is pervasive in many of our communities as well. I want to thank Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite again for reminding us again of that nexus of the need of individuals and people to be able to have good housing and good quality housing as being important again to their well-being and to their dignity as well. And perhaps that is a signal message, Mr. President, on which I will rest my presentation in the context of this resolution, that we ought to be, all of us concerned, where we have people within our communities, where we have people within this society who still, in this day, live in conditions that are not necessarily conditions that are fit for the type of Barbados that we want, the type of Barbados that we believe we should be aiming for. And that even as the government itself attempts to provide solutions in order for those households to be alleviated, in order for those households to live with a measure of dignity, that I am hoping that as we all recognize that it is not satisfactory, then that we all recognize our shared responsibility, either as citizens, from the private sector, even from the university, to be able to provide robust research and help with solutions as well, in order that we can take an approach to this that is, again, an all of Barbados approach. Mr. President, I do not ask that this resolution be now passed.
The question is that this resolution do not pass. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Bidding the ayes have it, this resolution is now passed. Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I believe that we have had a full day and we have now come to the end of government business for the day. I beg to move that this sitting of the Senate do now be adjourned, sine die, with the expectation, Mr. President, that we will meet not next Wednesday, Independence Day, but the following Wednesday to debate. The Senate will be advised accordingly of the items on the order paper.
Senator Dr. Hines.
Thank you, Mr. President. On the matter of adjournment, I rise once again to ask about the status of the question that I asked. Notice of the question was given on the 4th of May, 2022. I have heard a partial answer to the question in some places, in the media, in the other place, but I have not received an answer here. I have heard that there will be new child protection legislation introduced, and I've also heard that it will be introduced by the end of the year. I've not heard on the second part of the question, which asks whether this new legislation will repeal and replace the Juvenile Offenders Act, Cap 138, and the Reformatory and Industrial Schools Act, Cap 169.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Now, I wish to again offer the apologies of the government side for not having yet submitted the formal response. I have seen the formal response which has been drafted by the respective ministries. I believe on the last occasion that I rose, I advised that you're actually speaking about not one, but two pieces of legislation which fall under two separate ministries. One is under the ministry with responsibility, the Minister with responsibility for people empowerment, Minister Kirk Humphrey, and the second piece as it relates to justice is under the Ministry of Home Affairs, and we expect that the written response, which has been drafted and we have seen, will be submitted very, very shortly. I hope that that is a satisfactory answer, and I want to regretfully again apologize for the delay in submission.
The question is that the Senate do now adjourn, sine die. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Before we part, let me wish everyone a happy independence. This is our last sitting before independence, and a happy first anniversary of Republic. We hope we all participate in the various activities and that we all celebrate a very important milestone in our history. Happy independence to all of you and yours. Senate stands adjourned.